In the spring of 1846, George Donner and James Reed packed their families and their fortunes into wagons and left Illinois. They were prosperous farmers and merchants, part of a massive migration of ordinary, prepared people seeking fertile farmland out west. To cross thousands of miles of American prairie was an exercise in optimism. The skies were wide, the grass was green, and the journey ahead held the promise of a completely new life. But getting across the continent safely required brutal precision. It was an exact science of timing, where missing a milestone by even a week could ruin a family. This timeline visualizes the narrow survival window these emigrants faced. They had to wait until late spring for the prairie grass to grow high enough to feed their oxen, but they had to reach the Sierra Nevada mountains before the first autumn snow choked the high passes. Every day spent repairing a wagon or resting an injured animal shrank that gap. The pioneers were trapped in a strict mathematical equation, where any time lost on the trail translated directly into a loss of safety. By July, the Donner and Reed families reached Wyoming, trailing several weeks behind that necessary schedule. The invisible clock was running out. At a trail junction, they found a letter from a promoter named Lansford Hastings. He was advertising a new cutoff south of the established route, promising it would save them hundreds of miles of travel. This map compares the options. The established trail curves far north. The Hastings cutoff cuts a direct line through Utah territory, representing weeks saved. But Hastings had never taken wagons through it. They were betting their lives on incomplete data. The choice to take that cutoff is often remembered as an act of foolishness. In reality, it was a calculated risk made by desperate people trying to buy back the time they had already lost. The shortcut failed to deliver. Instead of a direct road, the party found themselves trapped in the Wasatch Mountains, forced to clear boulders and chop away dense brush by hand. They had to physically carve a path to inch their heavy wagons over terrain no wheeled vehicle had ever crossed. Work that should have taken days stretched into exhausting weeks. Once they finally cleared the mountains, they faced the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had promised in his notes that this would be a swift 2-day crossing. It was actually an 80-mile expanse of dry, alkaline earth. With water sources completely non-existent, the crossing took almost twice as long, and the draft animals began to wander off in the night, maddened by thirst. James Reed lost nearly all his cattle in the desert. Other families were forced to unhitch their oxen and abandon their heavy wagons entirely, leaving vital supplies sitting in the dust. The shortcut initiated a slow bleeding of their animals, wagons, and energy. By the time they reached the far side of the desert, their margin for error was destroyed. Pushing west along the Humboldt River in late September, the party was exhausted, diminished, and moving slower than ever. The mounting stress finally boiled over into violence. Following a dispute on the trail, James Reed killed a man named John Snyder in a sudden confrontation, and the rest of the party immediately banished him. Forcing Reed to ride ahead alone removed one of the only men with the resources and authority to manage the group. They were left fractured, arguing over the pace, exactly when coordination was a matter of absolute survival. By the time the wagons crawled to the base of the Sierra Nevada, it was late October. They were dangerously late, but in an ordinary year, they might have had just enough time to scrape over the pass. But 1846 was not an ordinary year. Heavy snow began falling in the mountains weeks earlier than usual, burying the trail and physically blocking the wagons from climbing any higher. The disaster was now locked in. Every lost day, the boulders in the Wasatch, the madness in the desert, the infighting on the river, had slowly closed the paths behind them, until the early winter shut the last door forward. Halted by drifts 10 feet deep, the families built makeshift cabins near Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, entirely cut off from the world and from each other. Their thin food supplies disappeared. They slaughtered the remaining cattle, boiled ox hides for whatever nutrition remained in the glue, and carefully rationed bone marrow, prioritizing the children as starvation set in. By mid-December, a group of 17 men and women strapped on improvised snowshoes and hiked into the brutal storms to find help. They became known as the Forlorn Hope. Several members of this group died from exposure on the trail. Only then, at the absolute edge of human endurance, did the survivors consume the flesh of those who had already perished. It was a narrowing choice between an unthinkable act and certain death. Later legends reduced the entire ordeal to sensational stories of murder for meat, but survivor testimonies and archaeological evidence confirmed the reality was far smaller in scale. Cannibalism was a grim final resort to keep themselves and their surviving children alive. Starting in February, 4 separate relief expeditions fought their way through the storms to pull the survivors out. By the time the final rescue concluded in April, roughly 40 of the original 87 travelers were dead. The Donner Party is often remembered as a monster story, but the facts reveal a deep tragedy, illustrating how ordinary ambition and hope can be systematically dismantled by the terrible mathematics of time and weather in the American West.